Alright, this is going to be another one of the comic book videos. If you saw the other one, I concentrated mainly on the Hound. I did go into Arya, and I think I just covered the basics in terms of her being sort of like Batman and Daredevil. Here I'm going to really hone in on Batman, but I think another influence, which I hope doesn't happen later on with Winds of Winter, but it might, and I'm just going to make my case. I think the Batman thing is very solid, but the other case I'm going to bring in is a little bit unclear, and I'm just going to put it out there and see what how people react to it. Okay, in terms of the Batman, and again I'm going to stress Batman, not Batgirl or even Batwoman. I do think George is borrowing structurally a lot from the Batman myth, and it's all over the place with Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. So let's just get into Arya herself, structurally, just as a character. Alright, so certain features of Batman. One, he was trained in a far-off land. Depending on which origin story you go to, it's usually Japan, though sometimes they'll change that. And obviously that mirrors what happens with Arya going to Braavos. Although she was trained a little bit at the very beginning, but it's still, the dynamic is the same, a sort of foreign, older mentor and the younger child, and she has to go somewhere to be trained, and that's going to mirror Batman. Another, of course, is Bruce is the son of a very wealthy family, one that has a lot of status, and that fits Arya to a T. There is a small difference that the Waynes are not technically a part of the ruling elite. I mean, they are part of it, but we don't know that they're actually political. Depending on which origin, they're just, they give away to charity, they have a lot of honor and status, but they're not really part of the governing class of Gotham. They could be, but it's not necessary. But Ned is. He is part of the ruling elite. He has literal, formal political power. That's a little different from the Batman myth, depending on which one we're using. And finally, parents are lost to tragedy or a traumatic event very, very early on in the hero's life. And again, that's very much what happens with Bruce, with his parents, and Arya and Ned. In fact, in the case of Ned, it's probably arguably much more traumatic, what happened to him. And Arya witnesses it. And so there is a kind of like fourth factor, but I think this is a little weird in terms of whether Arya feels guilt for not saving Ned. I think that's unclear. Definitely with Batman, he does feel guilt. He wasn't powerful enough to stop his parents from being killed. And it's also a little bit of a different dynamic that Arya wants vengeance. Batman is very much more unclear. You can read it as sort of metaphoric vengeance, but he doesn't really want vengeance against the actual person who is revealed to be Joe Chill. He obviously hates him, but he doesn't personalize the conflict, whereas Arya does. She just doesn't want to have, quote, a war against what the Lannisters represent. She wants literally to kill the Lannisters and their allies and a lot of other people. So it's a little different in terms of the dynamic, in terms of what's motivating them. So George is transferring a lot from Batman. I have no doubt about it. The structural pattern is pretty remarkable. But he is adapting a few things, and that's now what we're going to get into, which is in terms of Arya's powers. I know that's a big controversy with the Night King. That's usually where people begin and really have complained about that. I understand those debates, and I can understand where people are coming from. I guess I'm just not as invested in it, although I'll make my own commentary on that when we'll get to it. But there is a part of it in terms of her powers I think people have ironically not honed in on because they've concentrated so much on the Night King. They've really let go a really much more remarkable problem, which was the Valder Frey problem, where we already saw she had a huge amount of power and was able to shift not just her appearance, but her height and her weight. And we don't know the extent of the Faceless Men's power. We don't. And we do get a sense that they are very, very powerful. At least that's the way I read of the beginning of A Feast of Crows. I know there's a lot of controversies there, but I don't have much doubt that one of the Faceless Men is at the beginning of Feast of Crows, and he definitely demonstrates a huge amount of power in order to shape his appearance. So the Faceless Men do have a lot of power. But as far as I know, at least on the show, we don't know if they have the power to sort of take somebody's voice, because Arya just doesn't shapeshift into a larger person or even into a man, right? Which itself is kind of curious, but she's able to take Valder's voice. And as far as I know, Jaqen really can't do that, we do hear Jaqen at the beginning of Game of Thrones, or technically second season, but I'm gonna make a guess here. That's Jaqen's real voice. Now we know the appearance of who Jaqen is not him. Like, clearly this is the identity of somebody or some persons who were killed, if not by Jaqen, then by the Faceless Men, and he's able to take the face. But we don't have any indication that the Faceless Men can take a voice. We know that they can do mimicry. Obviously they can impersonate people, but I don't know how they would be able to capture somebody's voice. So that's another big issue in terms of Arya's powers. And so more and more I'm suspecting her power levels are very close to Mystique. If you don't know who Mystique is, she's one of the X-Men in the X-Men universe. She's usually a villain, but sometimes she's portrayed as a hero. There are other shapeshifters, like Morph. He's another shapeshifter. And if we get really technical, we can go into many other people in the X-Men universe as well as the Marvel universe. And again, George is more of a Marvel fan than DC fan overall. Even though Batman is huge in his stories, he's really more of a Marvel person. That's why I'm worried that Arya is going to more and more be turned into Mystique. Clearly she was in the show. She basically is Mystique in the show, though it's a very crude version of that character. But we don't know exactly what George is up to in terms of her power levels. At this stage, she's sort of in her Daredevil phase, just blind, learning the powers, becoming more and more like a Batman character, just becoming extremely muscular, well-trained, and able to seek out people. But we don't know the next stage in terms of when her training is complete, how much power she's going to have, what she's going to give up, who she's going to become. But I'm very fearful George is going to lean in on the Mystique kind of as a paradigm, because again, as we can see, he is sort of transferring a lot from the comic books. And if he is, I hope there's a bit of a twist or it's more complicated. But again, I'm very fearful that the show did in fact give us a faithful kind of preview and that her power levels are going to be enormous, which I think is fine for other characters, but if it is sort of a Batman mythos he's tapping into, that really doesn't fit at all the character, because Batman is defined by his powerlessness. And yes, occasionally Batman does get powers, but it's usually tragic. So if the character is defined by powerlessness and the lack of powers, attributing to them powers, I think, is always a very dodgy thing. But again, it's George. Maybe he'll pull off a miracle and make it cohere. But I think, putting Batman and Mystique together is not a good idea. But again, the Mystique part is more speculative. But I do think the Batman part and Arya sort of being, sort of superficially changed to be her own kind of Batman, I think is pretty obvious once we look at the clues. All right, this has been GRRM and Thrones Analyzed on the Mystique question in A Song of Ice and Fire. If you like the content, please hit the like button and or subscribe. Thank you for listening. Please be safe.